Bolter or Chainsword, pick your weapon and let's go. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about shooting versus close combat in Warhammer 40k, and the pros and cons of going quite heavy on either of them when you're building an army list. A few weeks back I made a community poll, asking if you had to choose only one between range and melee, which one would you prefer and why, and the results were actually far closer than I was expecting. As you can see, almost an exact 50-50 split of the vote, with range just taking it by a couple of percentage points. I must admit I wasn't entirely sure what I was expecting people to go for, but I thought it might be a bit more decisive than that. Obviously I think a lot of people just voted based on the army that they play and the playstyle that they enjoy, but I thought we'd talk about some of the in-game advantages of ranged and melee combat in the competitive game of 40k at the moment. Either way though, I'd argue at the moment that the two are more balanced than they've been in really quite a long while. Both 8th edition and 7th edition beforehand, I'd argue had a big focus on shooting over melee, generally less line of sight blocking terrain, bigger boards, and being able to just shoot your opponent to death and then move up to the objectives was a far more viable strategy. I think overall this very near 50-50 split has shown that Games Workshop have kind of got the balance between the two fairly spot on in 9th edition. In some of the previous editions it certainly felt like melee was a bit of an uphill slog, generally speaking of course. So let's get into some of the pros and cons of both then. We'll start with more firepower based armies, the pros and cons of shooting your opponent to death with bolter, missile launcher and melter gun. In general, the way that the shooting phase works is just a lot more reliable and predictable than melee. You can know for 100% guarantee if your unit's going to be in range of the enemy, your unit's going to be safe while they're dealing the damage, and being able to potentially hit things over the other side of the table means that you might be able to take out enemy threats that are far too far away to reach in combat, and hopefully neutralise priority enemy targets early. Planning the shooting phase compared with planning the fight phase certainly tends to be a bit easier in terms of which things you shoot first. Generally fire with things that have the least options first. There may be anything that's got really big swingy amounts of damage that might either spectacularly hit hard or fail completely, and then mop up with the more reliable things to whittle down the last wounds off depleted enemy units. It's perhaps a bit more complicated in the fight phase, knowing exactly what you're going to try and gamble to charge, and then which order you activate your units in to stop your opponent getting the jump on you with interrupts and things. I'd also say that the shooting phase is fairly predictable, and you can usually build around it quite easily in army construction. It's really not a hard thing, for example, to say include a Space Marine captain and lieutenant, know that all your units are going to be within 6 inches of those two, maybe give them a couple of buffing warlord traits and relics to make your firepower even scarier. Generally it's really quite easy to keep units within buffing aura ranges, and it's fairly easy not to make any positioning blunders that leave key characters exposed or have your units fighting out of aura range. Finally, I think that shooting is really quite handy for dealing with really small annoying nuisance units. Say if you have a couple of stragglers from a depleted squad on the flanks of your army, it's generally going to be more convenient to pick them off with a few bolter shots as opposed to sending one of your massive tuned up assault units at them. It's just kind of a waste of resources that you might be forced to overcommit if you are only relying on melee. Generally, I just do think that shooting has a bit of a reputation of being a bit easier to use, and particularly if there's not enough line of sight blocking terrain on the board, it can make Warhammer 40k into a bit of a reductive game of just point and delete the enemy unit. Still though, in 9th edition things very much aren't all a bed of roses for shooting armies. If you're following Games Workshop's examples on how to set up fairly balanced boards, then there should be a fair amount of line of sight blocking terrain about, and depending on exactly where the objectives fall or how elite the opposing army is, you might have a turn or two at the start where you're not able to gain line of sight on anything significant whatsoever. It could be very frustrating indeed if you're a shooting army that really wants to be blowing away the enemy combat units, and say you've got a force of fast moving and hard hitting Blood Angels or Dark Eldar, banding from cover to cover so you can't get a line of sight with quite a lot of your guns. In addition, shooting just really isn't the best way to deal with certain threats in 40k. Some units have special rules or abilities that just make them very annoying to deal with at range. Dense cover and light cover help with that, and there's plenty of stratagems that make the enemy harder to kill in the shooting phase compared with melee. Say for example the Astra Militar and Bulgrin Death Star, they can use the take cover stratagem to push themselves into ludicrously high saves, potentially easier to bring down in close combat, even if they will hit you back hard. Finally, if shooting armies do tend to get a bit overrun, then they risk potentially getting locked up and shot down. If you don't have a stratagem or ability that allows you to fall back and shoot in some way, it could be really frustrating to have one of your big infantry Death Stars just tagged by some enemy chaff. Even vehicles and monsters that can shoot in melee often will fear this as well, as though you technically could remain in close combat and just fire at the enemy with your guns. Often you're not going to want to do that, as it prevents any other unit in your army from firing at that same model, and it prevents that vehicle or monster from shooting at anything else on the board. So lots of wins for shooting armies, but certainly some disadvantages as well. If we move on to close combat, then I'd say perhaps one of the biggest advantages is that it usually has a much higher damage output than shooting, often by absolutely crazy amounts. Even some of the most efficient shooting units in the game will often struggle to compete point for point with a tooled up melee squad in combat. It kind of makes sense, the melee unit has to get all the way over to their opponents and deal with all the disadvantages of getting into melee, so it makes sense they will have some reward for getting there and achieving that. It's why if you're putting together power combos, usually the things that deal the very most damage for the points tend to be massive tooled up close combat Death Stars with layered buffs. I'd say that's certainly the main draw. Charging, piling in and consolidating can certainly be the difference between getting into objectives or not. You might be able to stop the enemy from shooting if you engage them in combat, and I'd also argue that at least from a fun perspective, the melee armies with high risk, high reward and lots of options for counterplay usually means that melee armies are really quite fun and dynamic to play both with and against. Obviously there's a big amount of personal preference that comes into that, but it's certainly one criticism I see levelled by you guys in the comments quite a lot against gunline armies, often being accused of being a slightly more boring way to play, just sitting there and aiming to point and delete all game long. Maybe one other slight advantage of melee is that you'll have more combat phases in the game than shooting phases, as you might be able to activate some of your units on the opponent's turn as well, having the potential to double dip on the damage if they either choose to have anything remain in combat or you manage to surround them and trap them. There certainly are some significant barriers to getting your Chainsword or power weapon armed maniacs into combat though, as there are quite a lot of things that can go wrong with a mass assault. You might fail a charge, you might be screened out by some chaff units, you might get blown away by Overwatch, and if you fail to kill the unit that you charge, your opponent might strike back very hard or use that 2 command point counter-offensive to turn a glorious charge into a complete disaster. Again, charging often isn't the best way to mop up individual threats as well. If you don't have a little bit of shooting, then you might have to commit entire scary combat units to wiping out tiny bits of enemy chaff, which is usually not going to be efficient. Depending on the army as well, an over-reliance on melee could perhaps leave you without doing enough damage in the early game, so your opponent builds up a bit too much of a lead it's hard to overcome. Overall, as I'm sure most of you are well aware already, most strong armies will generally have at least a little bit of both range and melee combat. That's certainly not a complete universal rule, you can have forces that go entirely down one way or the other, but I think that they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. I think in general, if you do just consider a force that's either 100% range threat or 100% melee, then just including 1 or 2 units of the other type of damage will add an incredible amount of value to the force, and maybe the more that you add of any one type of damage, the slightly more diminishing returns that you might get. For example, if the vast majority of your force is a close combat force, say if you're going for some bloodthirsty, fast-moving White Scars or Space Wolves perhaps, even just having a couple of gunline units could really be worth their weight in gold. They could really help out your assault army in so many different ways, picking off isolated straggler units that you can't be bothered to charge with a whole threat, perhaps softening up a scary enemy unit before you charge it with one of your threats and ensuring that you win the combat that way, or maybe just getting some absolutely early game damage in on a really critical and fragile enemy unit that would otherwise cause massive carnage amongst your force. Say for example your opponent had a whole bunch of Space Marine Devastators armed to the max with really heavy weapons, perhaps relatively fragile as firepower units go. Being able to pick up a squad or 2 of them early in the game could certainly save you a lot of pain later, rather than having to slog through their force and take the firepower every turn. It would also mean that the opponent might have to think a bit more about positioning and lines of sight, which if you were playing nothing but melee, you could basically forget all about putting units in cover or anything like that, as it wouldn't really give you as much of a benefit as if you were being targeted by ranged weapons. On the flip side though, if you were playing nothing but a massive gun line and you didn't have any melee units, then even adding 1 or 2 scary countercharge threats could be a real asset. If you're playing a gun line, then basically your opponent is really incentivized to rush you with as many units as they can, lock up all your army in combat, and really try and overextend themselves to try and tag as many of your units as possible. If you have a nasty countercharge threat or 2 hidden amongst your army, then you can punish any of those units that are really overextending, and hopefully smash them back into oblivion. For gun lines, that can often be quite good to do with characters that are buffing shooting units, maybe tool them up with some decent combat gear. In general, their job can be to buff the shooting, but if the enemy gets too close for comfort, they can lend a hand by cutting them into bits. Besides that though, I think it's still going to be helpful to have a couple of fast-moving melee units around, just to deal with those threats that you're otherwise going to struggle to be able to reach, maybe things hiding out of line of sight on objectives, or anything that has excessively powerful defences in the shooting phase that might be easy to kill in glorious close combat. Of course, plenty of units in the game certainly are very mixed role, maybe things like Space Marine Redemptor Dreadnoughts, Sisters of Battle Mortifiers, the Grey Knight Strike Squad with their Storm Bolters plus powerful force weapons. Usually they tend not to be as massively efficient as one of the dedicated gun platforms or dedicated combat units, but the flexibility can be very nice indeed, and certainly rate all of these very competitive units. Generally I find that quite a lot of units tend to build more around a ranged or melee strategy, depending on what their faction is usually best at. Say a Blood Angel's army will generally go fairly heavy on the melee side, but then add a few decent ranged firepower units that are just generically strong, just because you get such good returns on a small amount of shooting, as opposed to literally being a melee focused army and nothing but. Otherwise, some forces tend to use two different detachments, one that's based around shooting and one that's based around melee. Say perhaps Sisters of Battle having a dedicated melee detachment of Bloody Rose alongside a different order, or even say something like Chaos Demons allied alongside Death Guard, maybe the Death Guard providing some heavy firepower with some Plague Burst crawlers. In general though, of all the criticisms levelled at 9th edition, I think that they've managed to balance range and melee fairly well. Highly specialised armies of each can certainly succeed at top level play, though usually the incentive is to try and put the balance somewhere between the two, which I think makes for a bit more of an interesting game really, rather than just having to deal with the entire enemy just going down one strategy. So anyway, hope some of that has been at least somewhat interesting. Feel free to let me know which you prefer and why down in the comments below. Do you prefer heavy ordnance and masses of small arms, or high risk high reward punches slamming into the enemy with Chainsword and Power Fist? Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep these regular 40k discussions coming. There's new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with big model kits being given away at the start of each month. If any of that does sound interesting to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. Feel free to check it out if any of that sounds interesting. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.